Fadil Diggs has the chance to be the best Syracuse defensive lineman in over a decade.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network, where it's your team every day, and we're free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are going over the Syracuse football defensive line as we're only 27 days away from the Orange taking on Ohio and what could be a special 2024 season under first-year head coach Fran Brown. We're going over the defensive line, so we're going to start off with Fadil Diggs. Then we're going to talk about some of the returners for this team, and then the new defensive lineman for this upcoming season. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As playoffs wind down, the sport stops sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. So before we get into Fadil Diggs and why he might be the best Syracuse defensive lineman in a decade, let's talk about the scheme a little bit, because the scheme is very important and it's different than in prior years. Elijah Robinson is obviously a new defensive coordinator for this team. He's not new overall. He was a defensive coordinator and interim head coach for Texas A&M last year, but it's his first year with Syracuse. He runs a 4-2-5. For those that might be novices to the game of football, that's okay. I'll explain what a 4-2-5 is. It means 4 defensive linemen, 2 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs on the field as a base defense. In prior years for Syracuse football, they ran what's called a 3-3-5. That means 3 defensive linemen, 3 linebackers, and 5 defensive backs. So essentially, the only switch is in that front 6. And I'm not calling it a front 7 because it's not a front 7. It's a front 6. And that is, instead of 3 defensive linemen, it's 4 defensive linemen. Instead of 3 linebackers, it's 2 linebackers for their base defense. Now, the standout of this defensive line, by far the best player on the unit, and in my opinion, the second best player on Syracuse football's roster, is Fadil Diggs. Fadil Diggs is 6'5", 260 pounds. He is a transfer from Texas A&M. He is entering his last year of eligibility, so just this 1 year for Fadil Diggs. He projects to be one of the 2 starting defensive ends for Syracuse football next season. He was a 4-star transfer, but he wasn't just any 4-star transfer. He was ranked 56th overall in the country. 56th overall. That is higher than any of the basketball commits that Syracuse got out of the transfer portal. And Syracuse got some pretty good commits in basketball. Not elite, but pretty good. Fadil Diggs is ranked 56th in the country. For more context, Kyle McCord, I believe, was around the 80s, and I'm using the 24/7 sports rankings for this. Last year, Diggs was second on Texas A&M in tackles for loss. Of course, he was playing under Elijah Robinson, so he's very familiar with the scheme, so that's good. He also had 4 sacks on the team, and I believe that we can expect that sack total is going to go up because he's familiar with the scheme, like I said, but also he's transferring to an easier conference. The ACC is not the SEC, all right? They're 2 completely different leagues. The SEC is bigger, it's faster, it's stronger on average compared to the ACC. So I believe that we're going to see an uptick in numbers from Fadil Diggs. And I believe, obviously, we haven't seen him play it down yet for Syracuse, but just based on his pedigree alone, he might be the best defensive lineman for this team since Chandler Jones in 2011. And an interesting fact about Chandler Jones, guess what his career high in sacks was while at Syracuse? He played 3 seasons, 2009 to 2011. Just guess what it was. All right, now that you've guessed, aside from looking it up, if you looked it up, you cheated. That's okay, though. I don't know if you looked it up or not. His career high was only 4.5 sacks. That came in 2011. Now, granted, that was only in 7 games, but his career high was only 4.5. And the year before, he did play a full season or close to it and had only 4 sacks. I believe that Fadil Diggs is going to surpass both of those numbers. He had 4 sacks alone in the SEC. I think he's going to have an exceptional year and be the best defensive lineman in over a decade for this team. He was also severely underrated in the new NCAA football game. And I've talked about this before on the podcast. I don't actually play the video game, but I know people that do, and I've seen all the ratings. Fadil Diggs was given an 81 overall. Compared to the other ratings that were listed on the roster, that was far, far too low. Fadil Diggs is the best transfer that Syracuse got in the transfer portal. Okay, he's the best one that they got this year, ahead of Kyle McCord, and Kyle McCord is in the high 80s. So, take the ratings with a grain of salt from the NCAA video game. I just think it's an interesting thing to point out about Fadil Diggs. Not only is he good, he might be underrated nationally. Now, as far as the mock drafts are concerned, because this is someone who could have pro potential, I have seen mock drafts have him as high as a 4th-round pick in the NFL draft this upcoming season. And I've also seen some that have him as undrafted. So it's a wide range between, an early day 3 pick, which is the 4th round, and going undrafted. I think barring a catastrophe, he will be in an NFL training camp next season. A lot of players get invited to training camps. But when he is essentially in that group of players, and it's a large group across the country where you don't really quite know, right? You have a few slam dunk prospects every single year. You might have like 15 or so that they're going to be 1st round. And then a ton of players that essentially have no chance. Diggs is in that middle ground of a large clump of players that if he has a really strong season, which I think he can, then you're looking at possibly a day 3 pick, early day 3. If he has, a good season, then maybe he goes undrafted. I do see, as far as from a college standpoint, not a college to pro, just regular college with Fadil Diggs, I believe he definitely has all ACC upside. I know he didn't make the all ACC team, but keep in mind, they only released 1. And by the time we get to all conference teams, there's going to be multiple teams, right? 1st team, 2nd team, 3rd team. I believe that Diggs is going to make at least one of them, or he's going to make one, right? I just think he's too good. He's too highly rated as far as a transfer. He's going to stand out on this Syracuse defensive line because overall, I don't think it's the deepest unit on the team. He's really going to stand out and propel this team and help them win a lot of games. So overall, Fadil Diggs is the clear standout. He's familiar with the scheme, and I believe he can be the best defensive lineman for Syracuse in over a decade. So essentially since Chandler Jones back in 2011. Now, coming up, we're going to talk about some of the returning players to Syracuse football's defensive line for next season. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen of the day. For your second listen, enjoy the Locked On College Football Podcast. Spencer McLaughlin gets you ready for an exciting season on the gridiron with discussion on the upcoming season and the ever-changing landscape of college athletics, including conference realignment, the transfer portal, NIL, new college football expanded playoffs, and more. Locked On College Football is available on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Welcome back, everyone, into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and on today's show, we are going over Syracuse football's defensive line for the upcoming season, which is only 27 days away. Think about that. A long off season. We're less than 4 weeks. That's it. And we got Syracuse football back. Man, it feels good, right? It's got to feel good. Just take a moment. To just rejoice and realize that football is coming back. I love football season. We talked about Fadil Diggs earlier on the podcast and why I think with his pedigree, he could be the best Syracuse defensive lineman in over a decade, really since Chandler Jones in 2011. Also, shout out to Dwight Freeney, a defensive lineman for Syracuse who recently made the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, I don't think that Fadil Diggs has that upside Pro Football Hall of Fame, but still, Dwight Freeney, one of the great all-time Syracuse football players in the Pro Football Hall of Fame now. So congratulations to him. Now let's go over the returning players on Syracuse football's defensive line and their roles. Let's start off with Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff. He is 6'4", 289 pounds, so let's round up to 290 pounds. He's got 2 years of eligibility left, and he projects as a starting defensive tackle. He's only made one start in 3 seasons at Syracuse, so this is going to be a great opportunity to earn a lot of playing time on this team. Okay, this is a great opportunity for Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff. It's also a great opportunity for him to shed his reputation. And I really feel bad for players and for athletes and for coaches who are known for a mistake. Right. And there's more high profile ones than Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff. You can look at the NFL and Scott Norwood for the Bills, right? When he missed that kick. And I'm sorry to the Bills fans who are watching or listening, but nobody remembers that Scott Norwood was once an all-pro kicker in the NFL, right? They just remember that he missed that kick in the Super Bowl that lost the Bills the game, right? So it sucks when a player or a coach is known for a bad mistake or a bad play. But for Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff, at least for me, that is the case. He was the player that committed the late hit out of bounds a couple years ago against Clemson on the road. If you recall, Syracuse was the 14th ranked team in the country. It was late in the third quarter. The team was up by 11 points on Clemson. They were on their way to an upset. They were on their way. They had already forced a young Cade Klubnik into the game because Clemson benched their starter. It was DJ Uiagalelei. They benched him for Cade Klubnik. It was his first action, I believe, in college football. Syracuse is up 11. They have Clemson at a 3rd and 25. And Klubnik rolls to his right. He's basically out of bounds, about 20 yards short of the marker. And Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff commits a dumb penalty. A late hit out of bounds. It had to be called. And I understand in that game there were other controversies, right? The refs missed a late hit on Garrett Schrader in the 4th quarter. But they didn't miss that one on Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff. And it changed the game. Syracuse was up 11. They end up losing the game. Clemson goes down the field on that drive, scores a touchdown. So Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff, he's known that was the play, right? And it sucks that he's known for that. So hopefully this year he can shed that reputation, have a really strong season, and make us forget about what happened a couple years ago. Now let's move on to Denis Jaquez. He is 6'4", 260 pounds with 2 years of eligibility left. He projects as the other starting defensive end alongside Fadil Diggs. He's had injury history. The last 2 seasons, it's been cut short, so he's only played 12 games in 2 years and just 3 starts in 2023 in his entire college career. Last year, though, he had 12 tackles, 1.5 sacks is pretty decent. The goal for Denis Jaquez this year is to stay healthy. Period. End of story. 12 games in 2 years, has dealt with injuries. Obviously, sometimes you can't control injuries, right? But the goal, stay healthy. Stay on the field. Next up is Kevin Jobity. He is 6'4", 280 pounds with 2 years of eligibility left. He projects as a rotational backup that can play anywhere along the defensive line. And it's always good to have that versatility, whether you can play inside or outside. He's appeared in 21 career games in 2 seasons for this team. Last year, he had 30 tackles and 7 tackles for loss. Think about that for a second. 30 tackles, 7 tackles for loss, and he projects maybe to be a backup for this season. That's solid. That's solid. You would take those numbers as a starter. 30 tackles, 7 for loss. You take that as a starter, but for Kevin Jobity, a backup rotational piece, pretty solid backup right there. Finally, another returner here. Let's go with Braylen Ingraham, 6'4", 315 pounds. So he's a big boy. This is just his final year of eligibility left. He was an Alabama transfer. Heading into last season. He was once a consensus 4-star recruit, but by the time he had transferred to Syracuse, he didn't really play much at Alabama and was a 3-star transfer. And last season, I don't believe he started a game, but he did play all 13 of them. He had 16 tackles, 3 of which were for a loss. He's a fine backup, but at this point for Braylen Ingraham, I think I would not expect him to live up to the recruiting expectation that he had. I don't think that's going to happen. He wasn't able to do it last year. This is last year of eligibility, 5th year overall in college. I don't see it. Maybe he can prove me wrong. But overall, Braylen Ingraham, I think, is a solid backup for this team next season. And you need depth. You always need depth. Period. End of story. Especially in football. In football, you cannot rely on 1 or 2 players, because if you do and they get hurt, we saw with Oronde Gaston last season, you're done. You're done, right? So you need depth. And I think Braylen Ingraham, along with Kevin Jobity, provides solid depth along the defensive line from the returners. Now, coming up, we'll go over some of the new defensive linemen for this upcoming season. Now, Fadil Diggs is a Texas A&M transfer, but we've already talked about him, so we're not going to talk about him again on the podcast or the next segment. So we're going to talk about the other new defensive linemen on this team for next year. I love sports. I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down, we get fewer games and the sports aren't sportsing like I want them to. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. And if you're itching for football season like I am, we're just 27 days away. Well, guess what? FanDuel has released the odds for Syracuse's first game against Ohio, and the Orange are 15.5-point favorites to get the W. You think the Orange are going to cover? Well, bet it right now on FanDuel. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Welcome back, everyone, into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and on today's show, we are going over the Syracuse football defensive line for the upcoming season. We discussed earlier Fadil Diggs and why he might be the best Syracuse defensive lineman in over a decade. We talked about some of the returners and how a lot of them have great opportunities, either as good depth pieces or in the case of Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff, to shed a reputation for a bad mistake that he made a couple years ago. Now it's time to discuss the new defensive lineman for this team next season, not counting Fadil Diggs, because Fadil Diggs, we talked about in depth earlier in the podcast. So these are some of the other newbies here. Let's start off with Dion Wilson, a 6'5", 300-pound defensive lineman with just this year of eligibility left. He projects as a starting defensive tackle, so along the inside. He is a 3-star transfer from New Mexico State, and he was top 400 overall in the country. Now, the reason why I say that is because there are about 300 or so players in high school on a given class that are ranked as 4 stars or better, about 300-ish. So in transfer portal terms, being top 400 is pretty solid. Top 400 is certainly good, just not quite a 4-star transfer, but definitely one of the higher-end 3 stars in the country. He spent his 3 prior seasons at Arizona. He didn't really see the field all that much, didn't really acquire that many stats. So that's when he goes to New Mexico State. Has a good year with them, 30 tackles last season, also a sack and a half. So for next season, he's certainly got the size at 6'5", 300 pounds to be an interior defensive lineman in the ACC. And I got high hopes for Dion Wilson. Now let's go to another Alabama transfer along this defensive line, but this one is actually a new one, and that is Isaiah Hastings, 6'4", 300 pounds with 3 years of eligibility left. He is a 3-star transfer from Alabama, like I mentioned, but he has only appeared in one game in his collegiate career, and that was in 2022. He didn't even start that one either. He is a former consensus 4-star recruit. Very similar profile to Braylen Ingraham. They're very, very, very similar. The only thing I'll say about Isaiah Hastings and the difference between him and Braylen Ingraham is that with Ingraham, this is his last year of eligibility. So the odds that he lives up to the recruiting profile that he had is slim to none. It's slim to none, right? And we saw him last season at Syracuse. He was a backup. He wasn't even a starter. He was a backup, right? With Hastings, I think he's going to be a backup for this season, but there's still, I'm not saying it's going to happen, but there's still that hope that he can live up to his recruiting pedigree. There's that hope that's there because he's still got 3 years of eligibility left. So even if he can't be a starter for this upcoming season, maybe he's a starter in 2025 or 2026 and could be a really productive player. But it's really early on Isaiah Hastings. We won't know until he really gets on the field and shows us what he's got. Let's now move on to another transfer here. This is someone from JUCO College, and that is Michael Nwokocha. I think that's how you say his name. He is 6'5", 290 pounds with 2 years of eligibility left, so that's good, 2 years. He was actually a 4-star transfer on On3 from JUCO, and the college was Tyler Junior College, and he transferred to Syracuse back in January. Last season, he played in 10 games, and he had 32 tackles with 4.5 sacks. He projects to be a backup, but honestly, it's so difficult to project a player from JUCO level to ACC football. Even though the ACC is not the best conference in the country, not the second best conference in the country, I don't even think it's the third best conference in the country. It's still a top 4 conference in the country, certainly top 4. So it's a huge, huge adjustment. And kind of like with Isaiah Hastings, we are not going to know just how good or how bad Nwokocha is until we see him on the field. That's just how it is. So those are our 3 newcomers for Syracuse football's defensive line. Overall, we went over 8 total players. And if you think about it, that's 4 starters and 4 backups. Remember, Syracuse is running a 4-2-5 for this upcoming season. The 8 players that we went over, in case you missed it, or you need a refresher, we talked about Fadil Diggs. We went over 4 returners here, and that is Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff, Denis Jaquez, Kevin Jobity, and Braylen Ingraham. And we just talked about 3 additional newcomers aside from Fadil Diggs: Dion Wilson, Isaiah Hastings, and Michael Nwokocha. Those are in my opinion, going to be the top 8 defensive linemen for this team next season. 4 starters, 4 backups. Thank you for making Locked On Syracuse your first listen today. Now go check out the Locked On College Football Podcast. From NIL deals to never-ending conference realignment rumors, Spencer McLaughlin gets you ready for an exciting season on the gridiron. You can find the link to Locked On College Football in the description below, so you don't need to search. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And folks, that is it for the Syracuse football defensive line. We talked about 8 of them today. And if this unit is really, really good for next season, right? Fadil Diggs has an even better year than he's had at Texas A&M. And, some of their players like Elijah Fuentes-Cundiff has a good year, Denis Jaquez. Then maybe this defensive line could be one of the better units in the ACC. Overall, just from looking at it on paper, I would say it's around the middle of the pack, which is neither good nor bad. Middle of the pack for this defensive line for next season. 1 great player, solid depth, 1 through 8. It's just the starters. There's a little bit of question marks with the starters because there's some inexperience, injury issues. But overall, it could be a solid unit for this team next season. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for listening. If you like this video, click that like button. And if you really liked it, subscribe to the channel and turn on those notifications so you know right away when I am dropping the next podcast. Tomorrow, I'm going to propose the Poll Friday question. It could be football. It could be basketball. I don't know. You can find the Poll Friday question on my Twitter, which is at @LO_Syracuse. And in the YouTube community section, look out for the question, which is going to come out tomorrow around noon. Everyone, take care.